Okay, let's dive into this stack of sources you've shared. It's a genuinely fascinating collection,
It really is.
mixing historical documents, pension records with modern academic analysis and even commentary on a new musical.
Quite the range.
Our mission today is to take a deep dive into the life and legacy of Albert Cashier. He was a Civil War soldier, but his story, well, it refuses to fit into easy boxes, and it definitely continues to spark conversation today.
Absolutely. And using the articles, the research excerpts, all the material you've provided, we're going to try and pull out the most impactful insights. Think of it as building a clearer picture of Albert's experience, understanding the different layers, and really seeing why it still resonates so powerfully.
And having everything from primary sources to, like you said, cultural commentary gives us a lot to work with, perspective-wise.
Exactly.
So let's begin, well, at the beginning, focusing on Albert Cashier as a soldier for the Union, drawing on what's in your material. We learn he was born Jennie Hodgers, December 25th, 1843, in Ireland. Passed away October 10th, 1915. And his military service was as Private Albert D.J. Cashier, Company G, 95th Regiment, Illinois Volunteer Infantry.
That's right. And what's immediately striking, looking at the accounts, is that Albert was apparently already living as a man before he even enlisted.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, one piece you included mentions him working as a farmhand for a man named Avery. It suggests this wasn't, just a disguise put on for the war. This is how he was already living.
That detail, living as a man before enlisting, that feels really significant, doesn't it?
It does. It adds a whole other layer right from the start.
And your sources also put this in the context of, other women serving in the Civil War.
Right. The estimates vary, but you see figures like over 400 documented cases. Some even suggest up to maybe 1,000 women on both sides disguising themselves as men.
So how was that even possible back then?
Well, the material you provided points to a few things. First, a lack of the kind of official ID we have today. No birth certificates, no social security numbers, none of that.
Right, makes sense.
And the enlistment officers' physical exams, they were pretty cursory, mostly just checking for obvious things that would prevent someone from fighting.
Plus, you had ill-fitting uniforms. Soldiers often slept in their clothes.
Exactly. And sort of stronger social norms around privacy and modesty, especially in camp. All that combined could make it surprisingly feasible for someone presenting as male to avoid detection.
Okay, so moving into his actual service, he was clearly a full participant.
Oh, absolutely. Fought in major battles, Vicksburg included. His comrades, they knew him as Al or Little Albert.
Little Albert.
Yeah. And the accounts indicate they genuinely accepted him, called him an honorable member, one of his brothers in the regiment.
There's that particularly gripping detail mentioned about his capture by Confederates at Vicksburg.
Yes. And one source highlights his escape, interpreting it not just as, a soldier getting back to his unit,
but as something more.
but maybe also as an action that was critically about preserving his identity. Because if his sex assigned at birth were discovered by the enemy, well, the consequences could have been severe.
Yeah.
Much worse than just being a POW.
A really dangerous situation. And there was a lasting physical impact from his service, too.
Yes. The pension records you included mentioned chronic dysentery contracted at Vicksburg. It seems to have left him disabled for the rest of his life.
Wow. Okay, let's fast forward a bit. Look at his life after the war, based on the material about his time back in Illinois.
Right. He settled in Sonneman, Illinois. And remarkably, continued living as a man for, over 50 years?
50 years! That's incredible.
It really is. He held various jobs, mostly manual labor, it seems. Farmhand, church janitor, cemetery worker, street lamplighter.
Pretty typical jobs for the time, I suppose.
Yes, and the records suggest he was illiterate. And seemingly didn't have any family in America, a solitary figure, perhaps.
But he fully participated in civic life in ways women at the time absolutely could not.
That's a key point from the sources. He voted in elections.
Which is striking.
Very. And he collected his veteran's pension, though there's a note, I think, from a state senator, Ira Lish, describing him in the records at one point as entirely alone, destitute, and dependent on the charity of others. So it wasn't always easy.
Sounds like a tough but independent existence. So when did the discovery happen? How did his sex assigned at birth become known?
That finally happened in 1910. He was hit by a car, unfortunately, broke his leg quite badly, and needed hospital care.
And that's when?
That's when it was discovered. But what's interesting, as noted in your sources, is that the local hospital initially agreed not to reveal the information.
Really? They kept it quiet.
At first, yes. He was sent to the Soldiers and Sailors Home in Quincy, Illinois, to recover.
But things didn't end there.
No, his health declined. By 1913, likely due to dementia, he was transferred to a state hospital for the insane. And it was there, during routine care, that attendants discovered his sex assigned at birth. And the sources, they recount the really distressing detail that they then forced him to wear a dress.
That's awful. Did he accept that?
No. The sources note he clearly resisted, refused to wear women's clothing while he was at the asylum.
And this is where his story becomes public knowledge.
Exactly. The press got hold of it. And you see these sensational headlines like "Played man all her life" or "Posed as man 60 years." The narrative immediately got framed as, a woman who had deceived everyone.
Wow. And did that affect his pension?
Well, the Pension Bureau did launch an investigation for potential fraud. But this is where his comrades, his old Army buddies, stepped in.
His brothers in arms.
Yes. Multiple former soldiers from the 95th Regiment testified for him. Provided depositions, the sources mentioned names like Charles W. Ives and Robert Hanna. They affirmed that he was absolutely the same soldier, Albert D.J. Cashier, who fought right alongside them.
That must have been powerful testimony.
It was crucial. Their support helped ensure he could keep his pension.
That moment, with his comrades validating his identity as the soldier they knew, it feels incredibly significant.
It really does.
And it leads us right into how his identity and legacy are understood and debated today, which your sources dive into quite extensively.
Right, and this is where it gets, complex. The material acknowledges up front that historians can't definitively know exactly how Cashier understood his own identity.
Especially given the language available at the time.
Precisely. There wasn't the vocabulary like transgender back then. We can't just go back and ask him how he identified.
So the interpretations have shifted over time.
Definitely. Early accounts, especially in the newspapers and some historical writing, often framed him as a woman who disguised herself.
Right, the posed as man angle.
Yeah. And the explanation was often about gaining freedoms denied to women fighting in the war, earning a better living, independence, security, getting that pension. It was seen as sort of a practical choice, a means to an end.
But that's not the only interpretation now.
No. Contemporary views, particularly coming from the transgender community and also some scholars, they look at the same life story and see evidence pointing strongly towards him being a transgender man.
What's the basis for that view in the sources?
The argument basically is that his consistent, nearly lifelong commitment to living as a man, starting before the war, continuing for 5 decades after that, is the most compelling evidence.
So the life lived itself is the evidence.
Exactly. As some of your sources put it, by today's understanding, he'd almost certainly be considered transgender. That his living as a man for over 50 years is the proof, in a sense.
And that brings up the challenge, which the academic source discusses, of applying modern labels to historical figures.
It's a real challenge. Focusing only on sex, assigned at birth, or framing it only as a disguise, it risks erasing the possibility of a trans identity that just didn't have that specific name back then.
It highlights how fields like women's history and queer studies have had to grapple with how to interpret figures like Albert Cashier.
Definitely. And speaking of modern interpretations, one really fascinating one you included is the musical, The Civility of Albert Cashier.
Right. Tell us about that.
Well, the reviews and commentary highlight that it had an all-trans creative team, folks like Joe Stevens and Danny Shea, and featured an all-trans cast.
An all-trans cast. Wow.
Yeah, and it's clear from the material that the musical isn't just retelling a historical story. It's explicitly using Cashier's life to explore contemporary issues.
Like what?
Particularly the debate around transgender military service. One source even points out the timing, connecting it to President Trump's 2017 tweet attempting to ban trans individuals from serving. It shows how this life from the 1800s is still echoing in today's political and social landscapes.
That connection is powerful.
Yeah.
And you also included a piece offering a very personal perspective.
Yes, from Trish King, a retired Army NCO who is also trans. King writes about finding resonance with Cashier's story, the drive to serve your country, but also to live authentically, even within very rigid gendered systems like the military.
What was King's experience?
King shares finding purpose, camaraderie, and even a kind of clarity about identity through military service, and talks about the pride felt in finally being able to wear a uniform that represents their whole self. It really personalizes the connection many feel to Cashier's story.
That really underscores why this matters beyond just a historical curiosity. So the sources seem to conclude that while we can't know his inner thoughts with certainty,
Right, we can't know the language he would have used, but his life offers a powerful point of identification for trans people today. And importantly, he was ultimately honored as a veteran by the men who fought beside him.
that point about being honored by his comrades, it's reinforced by his burial, isn't it?
It is. The detail you provided about his burial with full military honors, and the fact that his headstone reads, Albert D.J. Cashier, Cumby G. 95 Ills Infant. That marks his service under the name he lived and fought under. It feels definitive in its own way.
Okay, so to broaden the picture just a bit more, let's place Albert Cashier's story within the wider context of gender nonconformity in the 19th century, using those academic perspectives you shared.
Sure. It was a period of significant shifts in how society understood gender and sexuality, moving away from primarily religious views towards more medical and psychological frameworks.
So new ideas were emerging.
Yes, this is when we start seeing terms like homosexual coming into use and concepts like a third sex. These ideas were often intertwined with how people presented their gender.
But at the same time, weren't things also getting more rigid legally?
Paradoxically, yes. Societal norms and legal structures were becoming more codified. Your sources mention examples like San Francisco's anti-cross-dressing ordinance from 1863 or the Comstock Law in 1873, which targeted obscenity and non-normative behaviors.
So more rules, more potential danger.
More danger, yes. But the academic source suggests something interesting, that this very rigidity, while creating legal risks, might have actually made it easier for some individuals to pass without detection if they strictly adhered to outward male presentation, like Cashier seems to have done for most of his life.
Huh. That's an interesting twist. And the sources also contrast Cashier's life with other figures from the era who challenged gender norms.
Right, to show the diversity of experiences. You have figures mentioned like Christian Davies, Eleanor Prochaska, Anna Luring, Malunga Savage, women who disguise themselves, often temporarily, for specific reasons like fighting in a war or maybe joining a loved one.
So a different motivation or duration compared to Cashier.
Seems like it. Their experiences, while definitely challenging norms, feel distinct from Cashier's sustained, lifelong identity as a man.
Then there's someone like Dr. Mary Edwards Walker.
Yes, a fascinating figure. A surgeon who served the Union, received the Medal of Honor, openly wore men's clothing, and was even arrested for her attire multiple times. She represents a much more public, defiant challenge to gender presentation rules.
A very different approach.
And then you have William Dorsey Swann, a freed slave in Washington, D.C. The sources mentioned him hosting drag balls, and he was arrested for female impersonation back in 1888. His story points to the legal dangers, but also maybe the emergence of early queer community spaces.
Looking at all these different lives like your sources allow us to do, it really emphasizes that there wasn't just one way people navigated gender expectations back then.
Absolutely not. And it also underlines how our historical understanding evolves, right? We bring new perspectives, new language to interpreting the past.
Exactly. These stories, Albert's included, they really challenge us to think beyond simple categories and appreciate the complex ways people have always lived their identities, even when the words and the social understanding were so different.
Well put.
So we've journeyed through the layers of Albert Cashier's life, really guided by the sources you shared, from his Irish beginnings, his Union service as Little Albert.
Through those 5 decades living as a man in Illinois, the late life discovery and all the scrutiny that came with it.
And finally, his burial with full military honors, recognized by his comrades.
His story, explored through all these varied accounts, historical records, modern analysis, personal reflections, even art. It's just a powerful reminder of the complexities of identity.
And the enduring human desire to live authentically, and the courage that takes really in any era.
Definitely.
It really makes you pause and think, doesn't it? What does Albert Cashier's life live so consistently as a man for over half a century, navigating a world without our modern language for his experience, yet ultimately validated by those who knew him best in the war? What does that teach us about the fundamental nature of identity itself, both then and maybe even now?
That's a question that really hangs in the air, I think. It invites us all to keep exploring how individuals define themselves, sometimes in ways that push right up against the boundaries of what society understands or accepts.
A lot to think about. Thank you for sharing this rich collection of sources. It's really made for an insightful deep dive today.